Welcome, everybody. Good to see you all here. I'm Diane Etzelweiss with Funeral Consumers Alliance of Greater Kansas City, and I'm the president. I am just here to welcome you all and make sure that you're comfortable. There's snacks out there. We do have a couple of planned breaks, but you are certainly welcome to go out and get a snack before we have an official break, whatever works for you. What I wanted to say to you today has to really do with the quality, the excellence of this particular group, this organization. I'm very proud to be part of it, and I've learned a lot over the 3 years I've been a member. So I want you to know that it's purely a volunteer board, and this whole conference was put on by the members of the board. So if I can get them to stand up here really quickly and I can just introduce them initially. Here's Amy Simmons. Amy is from UMKC, social work professor. Chiquita Miller, Kansas City, Kansas, works for K-State. EMA. Dave Johnson is our treasurer. We appreciate David's diligence. Jackie Amweg, who is with North Kansas City Hospice. All right, and here's Kate Sargent, who is our past president. Carol is out in the, Carol Condon is our webmaster. She is out in the lobby. And did I get everybody else besides Steve Nicely? Okay, Steve Nicely. And Steve is, unfortunately, for us, retiring from our board this year. And so he's been with the board for 18 years and has just been the carrying, I think, the power behind Funeral Consumers Alliance of Greater Kansas City. So we have more to say about Steve here. So, but I do want to invite people to look at our website. We're not going to go into great detail. There's a lot of information out there on our tabletop. Feel free to pick price surveys up. Our important work is educating the community and just being a group that can stand up for consumers of funeral services as we all eventually become. So one of the things I wanted to do is to give a lot of kudos to the board today. This has been a really hard week for me. My mother died on Tuesday, and so it's really a challenge for me to be here today, but the board has really stepped up and, has really made it a lot easier for me to be here. So I'm not going to be standing up here again. This will be my last time. There will be CEUs granted for people who are signed up for those. And I know there are some folks on Zoom who are also looking for CEUs. We will make sure that you get those later. I think evaluation may happen later. Okay, well, we'll get the information to you. And if people have concerns about that, just contact me later. Let's see. I think I want to go ahead and have Kate come over. She has a couple of words to say and a couple of other people to invite up. Do we want to invite Steve up?
Yes, well, yeah. I think it's a good idea. Get a look at it. Yeah, you come on up here, Steve.
Steve.
See, she's made friends with the microphone. Have I too? Can you hear me? Okay. Did you see that, Steve? That's live mic right there for your turn. If you want to say something when we're all through, we just want to say, wonderful Madam President, here with us in a difficult week, and nonetheless, she is still president, and we very much appreciate that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
This is Steve Nicely. We're going to say some things about him. And that's why we asked him to come up here, because maybe many of you know him, but if you're wondering, here he is, and he is a guy you want to know if you get the chance. He is one of those, in Wyoming we would say, cheerful in all weathers. That's absolutely something we can count on, is that he will shine his smile on us and pick up the slack and make this organization work as he has for 18 years. In an organization where ain't nobody getting paid, it is amazing to me, it knocks my socks off, that we have this longevity, this continuing mission to assist people who are in need of information at one of the most difficult moments of their lives. And Steve is the most visible expression of what it took to get that done. Watch him, you'll know how to do stuff. And being able to make space in our group over that period of time for something as important as people having information they need when their heart is broken. Can't do better than that. Steve, you're a wizard, and we all love you.
Thank you so much.
Good. So give him a squeeze when we get through talking to each other.
Hold on a second. So I have a few words from one of our past presidents, Sally. I met Steve over 12 to 13 years ago when I was a clinical social worker and heard about the Funeral Consumer Alliance. I found out that Steve was a journalist with the Kansas City Star and had worked with my father, Doug. So I didn't realize there was that connection. Yeah. From that point on, Steve always felt like a father figure to me. So hopefully, I'm in the will. Is she?
Yes,
Okay. We heard it from him.
there's nothing in the will.
Okay. Coming to all the meetings dedicating his amazing writing skills to so many newsletters, which is true, so many, and delivering a lot of price surveys to my front porch so I can distribute those to social workers I taught in Kansas City. Steve has been an ever-present support through 2 children and a growing career. I haven't been able to make meetings or be that involved anymore, but I have such fondness for Steve and the group. Thank you, Steve, for all you've done. That was from Sally, very kind. She might show up later, but we'll see. Good. So I have a couple more people that wanted to just come up and sorry for just dragging it on for a little while. So I think David has something he wanted to share, and I think Carol, where did Carol go? Is Carol still sitting out there? I'm going to let David talk.
Hi, I'm David Johnson. I'm the treasurer of the board. I've known Steve for about 10 years. My first knowledge of Steve was reading a magazine article that he authored about natural burials, and he also talked a lot about his interest in spirituality and mysticism. And a couple of years later, I met him at a weekly prayer group that he and I attend called the Mystic Misfits. And a couple of years after that, Steve asked me if I wanted to serve on the board. And I think part of the reason was because my background is in accounting, and one of FCA's most important contributions to education is to produce the, every 2 years we do a price survey of funeral costs. And with my numbers crunching background and interest, I'm a primary person for that. I also pay the bills, and because of that, I have the honor of presenting Steve with a card signed by the board, and there's a little gift in there for you and Marcia, and we hope you'll enjoy what it represents. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Yay. It's a gift card to his favorite restaurant. That's got to give it away.
My favorite restaurant.
O'Neill's. Yeah. So did Carol ever come in? I don't think Carol's here. Okay, so Carol, no. Oh, there you are. Do you want to come up? Oh, okay. She's like, no. But Carol did a great job. So we have a little plaque for you as well to put in your office.
Oh, boy.
It's just a thank you. It's just, Steve has served tirelessly for 18 years in a variety of roles: newsletter editor, program chair, president, funeral price surveys, and a host of other informal jobs. A huge thank you for his help with the newsletter. All right. Thank you so much. Do you want to say anything?
I thought I was going to be able to slip out unnoticed.
Oh, my God. What were you thinking? Okay, so you'll hear more from Steve here in the next section. Do you want me to take your stuff down? Because you're on next. You and your friends are on next. Okay, you want me to take your stuff down? Or you can leave it up here. All right, so now I'm going to, do you want to introduce?
my stuff
I will take your stuff down, because you're going to introduce the next set of
Yeah.
speakers, and you're one of them. So thank you, everybody, for
Okay.
being patient with us, because we really did want to honor Steve for all of his work and his leadership, really, over the last 18 years. All right, thanks, Steve.
So it's my privilege to introduce first today our guest speakers who represent the professional funeral industry. And these two are seated right up here, have known each other since 1994 and 1995, when Wiley Wright was an instructor at the KCK Community College School of Mortuary Arts, and Bridget Anaya was one of the students. So it's been quite a while since they've known each other. First, I'll introduce Bridget. Currently, she is general manager of Longview Funeral Home and Cemetery, and general manager of Johnson County Funeral Chapel and Memorial Gardens. And before she took those positions in 2019, she spent 23 years at Charter Funerals here in the Kansas City as manager of those. She has a bachelor's degree in accounting from Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa, and her associate degree in mortuary science. I want to say one thing about the ownership of her funeral homes. Park Lawn Corporation, the largest publicly traded Canadian-owned funeral, cremation, and cemetery provider in Canada, and also rapidly expanding here in the United States, and also in Kansas City, including Park Lawn Funeral Home. So Park Lawn Corporation is buying Park Lawn Funeral Home, Mulebach Funeral Homes, and Speaks Funeral Homes. And I think there's probably a couple others too. So first I'll introduce Bridget. You want to come up? Will you, okay, you're going to speak one at a time.
I think, yeah, and I think I'll use the mic and walk around if that's okay.
Fine.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Thank you for that introduction. That was much appreciated. And as Steve mentioned, I was a student of Wiley's many, many years ago and appreciate all that he taught me through the years. And I'm happy to be able to continue in the industry for going on 30 years now and being able to share what knowledge I have with the public and with everyone. So just kind of wanted to give you a little bit of kind of information about what we're going to talk about today. I know we talked about calling this, let's see, we're not clicking. think the slide says trends in the funeral industry, but I kind of wanted it to be, I think a better title maybe would be kind of what's new in the funeral industry. Is it working there? It's not saying here. I know we tested it.
Okay, it should click in a second.
Okay, that's fine. So, as opposed to saying trends, I would say what's new in the funeral industry. So I think that most of us, when we think about traditional funerals, we kind of know in our minds what we mean by that, right? We mean, there it goes. There's our agenda for today. So what do we mean by a traditional funeral? When we think traditional funerals, we think casket, flowers, visitation, funeral service at a church or a funeral home, maybe a procession to the cemetery, the burial, maybe a reception afterward. That's what has been considered to be the traditional funeral through the years. We still do that, but we sure aren't doing it as much as we used to. And part of that is just, and we'll speak about kind of the whys of that later on, but you know, it's generational, it's the fact that people live so far away from each other now, it's ecological, there's just a lot of different reasons that people get away from the traditional burial. But for many, many years, your choice was you could be buried or you could be cremated. That was pretty much it, right? So cremation has become a lot more prevalent, obviously. But one of the trends that we're seeing is with personalization. So even those that are still doing traditional burials or cremation, they want more personalization. They don't want a cookie cutter funeral. They want to be able to personalize their caskets. So that includes maybe ordering a special type of head panel that can go in there that represents what their loved one was into, hobbies or interests or flowers or something like that. Those that are cremated have the opportunity to have engravable urns. So it can have their name, but can also have hobbies, things like that that mean something to them. We also offer fingerprint jewelry or accessories, keepsakes for people that are cremated or not cremated, that the family can keep at home with them. Laser-etched headstones. I mean, there's just a lot of different ways that people can have personalization. So personalization is really big. It has been for a number of years. That's not anything new necessarily, but it seems like our casket companies and our urn providers are coming up with lots of new and exciting things. So when we talk about cremation, a lot of people think cremation just means cremation. You just cremate me and take me home and put me on your shelf. Cremation, you can still have a viewing. You can still have a traditional funeral service with the cremation to follow. Or you can have the cremation first and then a memorial service. Or you can have cremation and no service. You can still have a burial. You can take the urn home. You can scatter the ashes. There's just a lot of different choices for cremation. But here are some things that are newer and maybe a lot of you don't know about yet. So how many of you have heard about alkaline hydrolysis or are familiar with what that is? So this is something that isn't necessarily new, but it's new to our industry. So it started out back in the day, farmers were using it for farm animals that died on the farm. That's something I learned from my dad. I did not know this. Some veterinarians' offices have been using it for a number of years, and the first funeral home use was in 2011. So here in our area, it is legal, however, there is not a place that does this. So alkaline hydrolysis is kind of what we also refer to as water cremation. So it's cleaner. You don't have the ash and the soot going into the air. What you receive after alkaline hydrolysis is very similar to ashes that you receive after cremation. They are pure. They are pulverized down to ash, just like with a traditional cremation. And I think this is something that we're going to see a lot of in the future, and you're going to hear more about this, I would anticipate, in the next 5 to 10 years. Hasn't made it to our area yet, but like with most things, it'll get to us eventually. So just very interesting and just another option that we'll be looking for here in the next few years. How many of you have heard about human composting? So this one is really interesting, and this so far is only legal in 6 states. But again, this is another alternative for those that maybe don't want to be buried in the ground, embalmed in a casket. They have what the actual term is natural organic reduction. So they use a vessel full of organic materials, and they lay it over your body, and then they put you in this little pod, and then you just decompose naturally. It's more environmentally friendly. I've got a picture of what it looks like, if you can see that picture. So this is a person that is about to go into the capsule, but you can see that they are covered with organic material. So it's, it can be actual compost, it can be twigs, it's just anything that helps the body decompose naturally. It just kind of speeds the process along. After this process, if the family would like, they can receive their loved one's remains back in, it's almost just a compost style box, compost remains, so very interesting. And then I added this fun fact in here because in 2019, there was a push in Missouri to legalize Viking funerals. Does anybody remember that? And I thought, well, that's really interesting. Who's going to do it? I don't know, you never know, but it got voted down. Viking funerals are where you go out on the water and somebody shoots flaming arrows at you until they get you, and then you burn. But it was also, that wasn't so much what they were going for. It was allowing people to be cremated in their own yard or on their own land. So far it's a no-go, but that's something that was put in front of the governor a number of years ago too. So I'm going to let Steve talk in more detail about this because this is kind of his thing today that he's going to discuss. But I do want to just briefly touch upon green burials because this is something that we're definitely hearing a lot about. This is not new, but it's new to us in our area. So what a green burial typically is no formaldehyde-based embalming. Now we do have chemicals that can be used for preservation of the body that don't have formaldehyde in them. So they are not toxic to the earth. They will preserve a body for a couple days for a viewing, but it does not have the same effect as formaldehyde-based embalming. No metal caskets, no concrete vaults, no metal headstones. You don't have to use a casket at most green burial gardens. You can use a shroud, you can use a wicker casket, you can use a wood casket as long as there's no metal hardware. The grounds are minimally maintained, so this is just at my particular cemetery. I'll show you what it looks like. You can't tell by looking at it, but this is our green burial garden at Longview Cemetery in Kansas City, Missouri. So as the grass grows higher, we cut a path through there, but we don't do a lot of maintenance. It's maintained, but it's not manicured. So it looks like a very natural field in the woods. And we have space for thousands of people back there because we really do believe that going forward, this is something that a lot more people are going to be interested in. We did have, we've done several green burials since we opened this garden last year. And one of the questions that came up, which we hadn't really thought about, is, can my wife be buried with her jewelry on? No, actually she can't, and it's not something that we had given much thought to, but if we are going to be a truly green burial garden, we can't allow any metal in the ground, we can't allow anything, no plastic flowers, everything's very natural. So just kind of something that was an interesting question that came up. So those are just kind of some of the newer things that we are seeing in the funeral industry. There's new things every year. I just learned recently at a convention about this company that is taking ashes from alkaline hydrolysis and turning them into rocks. So you can actually be a rock. And some of you have probably heard about the pods where you can be in a pod and then you decompose and then you can be a tree. So there's just, it's not for everyone. Everybody has their own opinions about it, but it's just really interesting the things that people are coming up with. And there's going to be more and more new things, I think, in the coming years that we haven't thought of yet that are going to help us to preserve the environment, preserve our space. You know, we're running out of cemetery space. Keep that metal and concrete out of the ground if that's, if that's what the families want. So that's just kind of my little synopsis about what's going on in the funeral world. Does anybody have any, do we want to open for questions or do we want to wait till everybody's gone? Okay. Anybody have any questions about any of that? I kind of went through it quickly. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question from the Zoom chat, excuse me. Somebody is asking, what about people who have metal implants like rods, screws, et cetera, in green burial?
That's a great question. So in the funeral industry, we have always removed pacemakers, regardless. Whenever somebody's cremated, we remove pacemakers. So we're used to doing that. That's not a difficult thing for us. But metal implants for a green burial, yes, those would have to be removed. So we would have to discuss with the family, we would have to get permission to do that. And then we as funeral directors would be charged with having to figure out how specifically to do that. And I'm sure we can make it happen. It's a good question. Yes?
Another question. How much does a green burial plot cost?
So at our cemetery, the green burial plots are not any less expensive than a traditional burial plot. I think at Longview, they run around maybe, and I'm spitballing here because I don't have it in front of me, I'm going to say around $3,000 for a plot. So they're not necessarily less expensive. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Yes, I don't remember looking in the green burial spots. This was probably 6 or 7 years ago. I'm sure everyone can hear me without this. But, sorry. My question is, do you know, are there other green burial sites in Kansas City, or is yours the only one?
There are not very many. So in our area, we have Highland in Prairie Village, which Steve will speak on. There are some cemeteries that don't require outer burial containers, but they aren't necessarily designated as a green cemetery. I believe Brookings Cemetery in Raytown is one. But to my knowledge, Longview and Highland and Prairie Village are the only ones in the immediate area, and then I believe there's one in Lawrence also. So it's not something that's very common yet. I think we'll see it in the next few years. I think we'll see more cemeteries setting aside gardens for that.
He's been waiting.
Sure.
Since there is no requirement to use the funeral home, is there a cemetery where you can dig, the family can dig the grave?
Not to my knowledge, because most cemeteries, from a liability insurance standpoint, would probably not encourage that. A lot of times people will have burial spots on their own land, which obviously that's fine, but I don't know of any cemetery that allows anyone other than a cemetery employee come in and dig, not to my knowledge. Yes, ma'am?
And so there are no markers.
So we do allow markers, but they have to be natural markers. So they have to be granite or natural stone. We can't have any bronze plaques or any vases or any, artificial flowers or anything like that. But yes, they can be marked. And they can be marked with, in my opinion, the more natural looking stone, the better. So we've had some people that have bought little boulders to put out there or just little flat granite markers, but it's got to be some sort of natural stone.
And it could be lasered or something.
Yes, yes.
To indicate. And then also, so that answers one of my other questions then. And is it 6 feet deep?
Yes. It's a great question.
When it comes to alkaline hydrolysis, how many gallons of water does it take to dissolve a body? And what happens to it afterwards?
I don't know the answer to how many gallons. I don't know if that's something you know, Wiley. It's a lot.
I can't tell you how much water, it just goes down the sewer.
Yeah.
But it's one of the cleanest methods of disposition.
It's very sterile, very clean.
I had heard it was at the average of a household of 4, the water usage for a weekend. I don't know how accurate that is.
It's possible, yeah. I would imagine it requires quite a bit for the process. And that process mimics natural decomposition more so than a lot of the other processes that we see.
Which one is that?
The alkaline hydrolysis, the water cremation.
Said something about pods and you can become a tree. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
So there's a company, and I don't know the name of the company, but not completely clear on how they do it, but they contort your body into a shape as such as you will fit into this little pod. So then you are buried, planted, and then as you decompose, the natural organic matter feeds this tree, and then the tree comes up, and there you are. And that's actually what my own mother is choosing for her disposition. So I'll know more about that in another 30 years probably, but yeah, it's very interesting stuff.
It's very similar to like a wetsuit for swimming, in which it's a cover, in which there's a zipper, then the pods are already, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And it's already, the ingredients for the plants are already embedded into the garment.
Is that the mushroom soup?
Yes.
And he's going to talk a little bit about that too. That's interesting. Well, thank you all. Appreciate you letting us be here today, and always feel free to reach out if you have any other questions about any of this or funerals in general. I'm happy to educate. Appreciate it.
Now, I'd like to introduce Wiley Wright. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Education, KU. He has an Associate of Arts degree in Mortuary Science from the Kansas City, Kansas Community College, where he's now in charge of. Has a Master's of Arts in Education. And he is the full-time coordinator of the Kansas City, Kansas Mortuary Arts Program. He was a part-time embalmer at Porter's Funeral Home in Kansas City, Kansas, which is the same funeral home where I worked during community college at Donnelly College a long time ago. The interesting thing is, he did that for 31 years. And besides being a full-time instructor, he did that at night a lot of the time. So, and the other interesting thing is, for 38 years, and he's still doing it, he's the head swim coach at Shawnee Mission East High School. So, Wiley, will you come up and give us the benefit of your wisdom?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. Been a long admirer of the organization here, even back in the 90s. Steve, you've done a fantastic job. And again, I'm a secret admirer. I've been watching this organization for over 30 years, and you're leaving it in great hands. And we congratulate everything that you've done. Really do appreciate it. So hopefully this will work. Not used to having it working, but I'm Wiley Wright. I'm the coordinator of the Mortuary Science Program at Kansas City, Kansas Community College. I'm a graduate of that program back in 1982. Worked in high school, Fulton Nichols Funeral Home back in the 70s. So I've been around the profession for almost 50 years. And you talk about changes. Probably the last 20 or 30 years have been a great amount of changes, and there's reasons for that. I've been worked at various funeral homes before I went in to the education part of it. I've been at Kansas City, Kansas Community College since 1985, and the coordinator since 1993. So, couple of things, I'm sure you probably already know it, but the cremation rate, I went back, when I graduated from college, the cremation rate was 12%. And I can remember back then, even when I worked in high school, there was only 4 cremation or crematories here in town. And in fact, Porter's Funeral Home, where I worked, used to take their bodies over to the Elmwood Cemetery. I'm sure you all know the Elmwood. They were the last kerosene crematory that they had in Kansas City. And basically they used kerosene as their mode of fuel. So we're talking way back then. And basically we would probably in a month's time maybe do 3, maybe 2. So it was not an everyday occurrence like it is today. So, and you can see over the years how it's increased. In 2013 it got up to 45. And now it's roughly 60, and you can see in another 20 years it's going to be 80%. And that pretty much means that if you did 10 services, 8 of them are going to be cremation. And you may ask, how did we arrive at that? And I think there's a number of items that probably contributed to it over a period of time. I always kindly say, probably the start of the microwave started that, because now you can cook your meals in half the time. And so it kind of got the generation thinking, you know, let's do things quick. Okay? And it's kind of progressed to basically the use of the phone now. You can do everything on the phone. And I think over time, the generational gap has basically taken over as cremation as a potential avenue for disposition, and the use of the internet at the same time. And you'll see more options that are developing as a result of the internet. Before the internet came in, you never knew anything about any other mode of disposition. It was cremation, and then there was burial. Now, you name it, and basically, things can occur as a result of disposition. So I think the internet and the microwave and the phone has tremendously changed the route that's available to the families that are out there. Cremation driving force, the age of 65 to 84, less likely than any other age group to be cremated, therefore more likely to opt for traditional burial. More likely to have made financial provisions to pay for their own funeral. And then more likely to have made pre-need contracts, both financially and then also pre-need. Trends on the rise. You're seeing more and more, 25 or almost 26% have stated they would prefer to make arrangements online versus speaking directly to a funeral director. And I know of, and maybe Bridget may know, but I know of 2 firms here that offer cremation that you never have to go to the facility. You can make all the arrangements and never ever see a funeral director, and basically everything is done online. And I think you're going to start finding a little bit more and more that people are more comfortable using the internet at their own speed and what they feel comfortable, and not having to go into the funeral home to make the arrangements. And again, that wasn't available 15, 20 years ago. Also, this is a big one. 53% of individuals have attended a ceremony other than a funeral home or church. They're having the ceremony other than going to that facility. So, and again, I think you're going to find more and more opportunities of people going elsewhere to have their remembrance and their celebration of the individual. And again, the preference, again, cremation, casket with burial, not sure, alkaline hydrolysis, it's just more and more different. Funerals are not what they used to be. Again, many people plan funerals these days foregoing the traditional practices and are both looking to reinvent practices around death and dying and find new and unique ways to memorialize their loved ones. And again, a lot of it they're learning on the internet, via other streams of information that's provided to everyone. And again, your organization has done a great job of promoting other ways to memorialize individuals. And again, it wasn't like that 30 years ago. You know, it was more or less a cookie cutter. You had the funeral, you had the visitation, went to the cemetery, and that was it. So the more options that people have, it's going to be able to fit what they believe is very important to them and their families. Some interesting trends. We were talking about compost. There's a mushroom burial suit. It's an eco-friendly way. It's a mushroom burial suit, also known as Infinity Burial Suit by manufacturer Coco. It's a biodegradable burial shroud made from mushrooms. At the time of burial, the deceased is dressed in the suit, and it should be buried within 24 hours to help ensure the mushrooms germinate properly. Typically buried at a depth of 4 feet, and must be used in a green cemetery. And the cost for the suit is roughly $1,800 to $2,300, which is comparable to a casket. Another trend. You're finding more and more higher education institutions or colleges offering on campuses a final resting place. More and more schools are building a campus columbarium, and schools such as Notre Dame, University of Virginia, Hendrix College, Citadel, Duke, they have a columbarium on site of their institution. And again, I think you're finding more of that is going to be coming in the realm. And again, I was unaware of this, but Pittsburgh State University has a columbarium adjacent to the Timmons Chapel. It serves as a place of reflection and remembrance of Pittsburgh State graduates, faculty, staff, and donors. Each niche holds 2 urns and is covered with a granite plate engraved with biographical information, and the cost is roughly $4,000. So again, it's just another place for if you wanted to place your cremains or your loved ones on their campus. I'm waiting for our school to do it. And I always kiddingly said, it used to be the motto of our school. Their motto was making life better. And I always wanted to have that put on my gravestone. Making life better, being dead, gone. But they didn't take, my wife would not have that. But. And then another is ossuary disposition receptacle, which is a communal placement of cremated remains. It provides an affordable interment option for those who do not desire a niche. It's usually 1/3 to 1/2 the cost of a traditional niche. It's a soft urn with the cremains are deposited into the center of the niche opening. A biographical information is engraved on the side of the columbarium. The company that manufactures is based out of Crookston, Minnesota. And there is one in Goodland, at the Goodland Cemetery, and also Johnson County Memorial in Longview have this type of facility in which it looks like a columbarium, but it's a communal. Basically, you deposit it in a soft urn, and basically it's mixed with the other cremains that have been in there, and then you have a plaque for your whatever biographical or saying that you'd want for those loved ones. And again, it's just another avenue that's out there for families for another mode of remembrance and also disposition. So, and I think that's anything, any questions?
We have also, at one of our cemeteries, Wiley is ossuary, it's communal, but you still get your little name plaque on there too, so it's something, it was a term that I had never even heard before, so there's just always new things.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. You ready? Okay.
I just have to speak out on behalf of natural burial. And Bridget did a good job of describing what it is, so I don't think I have to do that. Just one, 3 or 4 feet deep is ideal for the burial in a natural burial, because that's where most of the microbes are contained in the earth that will decompose the body. Some cemeteries don't like that because they're afraid an animal will come and carry off part of the body. And one funeral director in Lawrence told me, I said, we were arguing on behalf of the depth, and he said, how would you like to wake up one morning and find a hand in your front yard? And so they bury 5 feet deep in Lawrence. And this, but I just want to say, natural burial was the standard method of burial throughout human history until just until the Civil War. In 2009, the city-owned Oak Hill Cemetery in Lawrence became the first in modern times to offer natural burial around here. But it was another 10 years before we could find a cemetery in the Kansas City area that would allow it. We found the historic Highland Cemetery of Prairie Village, which dates from the middle 1800s, when all burials at Highland were natural burials. So we contacted the sexton, who told us, you can have it if you want it. It still had 150 graves available for sale. We formed an independent nonprofit corporation and assumed management in 2015. 5 years later, all of the remaining graves had been sold, mostly to those seeking natural burial. And now all but a handful of Oak Hill Cemetery, 250 graves, have been sold in the natural burial section. So today, natural burial graves are also may be obtained, but only in 2 cemeteries in the metropolitan area, Elmwood and Longview. Highland Cemetery is sold out, so it's still available there for those who have the space. And thank you, Bridget, for bringing natural burial to Longview. Okay, Lyle Van Vliet, a board member of both the Funeral Consumers Alliance and Highland Cemetery. He wanted a natural burial, and he got one. But there was something unnatural about his funeral service. His unembalmed body, in its cardboard casket, remained in the hearse outside because the priest would not allow it inside. And I suppose it was because he feared the body that had been dead several days, had decomposed, might smell, or even possibly leak through the cardboard. And I accept part of the blame for this misunderstanding. I and the funeral director should have briefed the priest and assured him that there was nothing to fear, that the body had been preserved by refrigeration and had been washed and prepared against any possible embarrassment. These are the grandchildren of Randy and Nancy Joe. And they're on his engraved boulder that marks the grave, the natural burial grave in Oak Hill Cemetery in Lawrence. Nancy, a past president of the Funeral Consumers Alliance, and Randy had talked about natural burial. When he died suddenly, he was part Native American, and he liked the idea of his body being returned to the earth in its natural state. Then he died suddenly. Nancy commented about the natural burial experience, saying, "It gave me so much peace. It was way more personable, almost healing. And this way is better for the earth." That is the shrouded body of my good buddy from childhood, Nick Delano, in his Highland Cemetery natural grave before it was refilled. I was up there, I say up there because it's called Highland for a reason, it's high. Tuesday, visiting his grave and Lyle's grave and the graves of several others I knew. I greet them, ask them how they're doing, and wish they could respond. Here's another of my good buddies, Terry Woodbury, and he's still very much with us. Highland is sold out, but Terry bought this grave from an owner who had one to spare. So here Terry is trying it on for size. Only 2 out of 62 public cemeteries in this metropolitan area of 2 million people offer natural burial. Why am I not discouraged? I don't know. Maybe it's because I view nature as something sacred, as the most obvious manifestation of the divine that's available to us. I think humanity is at a tipping point of realizing the importance of the environment. While cremation pollutes the air we breathe, and embalming chemicals pollute the earth, natural burial achieves the opposite. I think Mother Earth is saying, I gave you your body. Give it back to me when you are done. I'll make good use of it. I'll convert it into nutrients to continue the cycle of life. Thank you.
I have a question from online. Are you aware of any shared family crypts for cremains?
I didn't hear that, Jackie.
Are you aware of any shared family crypts for cremains?
I guess not.
For that.
Joe? You want to?
There are some cemeteries where the families will choose to buy, multiple niches or multiple plots for ashes, just as they would a casket. So there are private columbariums at some cemeteries where it might just be all for one family, or sometimes they'll just buy one section of an existing columbarium. But yes, it's a thing. Yes.
Anything else? I think we're due for a break, aren't we? Thank you.
So we're going to use this time as a quick break. We have cake. We're going to go in the back and we're going to cut the cake for Steve to help celebrate him. Have a brief break. And what time should we be back? 2:30? Yeah. So 2:30 we will resume with the next part of the so let's go celebrate Steve.
Good habit.
Yeah, we just want to make sure that we're not, especially if you need to see you, so you're not trying to track us down and going back and forth. So if you could just leave that out, we would really, really appreciate that. Give me 2 minutes, I'm gonna give people that.
This is your 2-minute call. You have 2 minutes.
You have 2 minutes, 2 minutes. Go out and give us your email address for CEUs. You let them know online.
I mean, after online, they got the email with the Zoom link, so I assume we have their email.
I know. Oops. This was scary when we kind of start on time and we just notice this big clock to our left. And it's like it's like 2:30. We're like quite happy about that. All of the speakers, did you guys notice the big clock to the left as well? When you guys were speaking, did you notice the clock? They're like, you guys are great. You guys are great. You know your timing, everything, so it's great. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started so we can be respectful of all of your time. Just remember, if you were a walk-in or for some reason you didn't register online, we just want to make sure we have your emails for your CEUs. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So this afternoon, we have a wonderful treat. So we have, speaking for us today on the changing landscape is Amy Simmons. She has a MSW, and she's a LCSW as well. She's with UMKC. She's been there for 8 years. Wow, long time. She is also a doctoral candidate in higher ed. So I was excited about that. So she's going to be defending soon, and so hopefully we can add some other letters behind her name. She's also been on this board for 2 years. So we're going to listen to Amy Simmons.
Is this working? No. It's working now. I saw a nod. Okay. So I am just going to fill some gaps with Wiley did a great job talking about some of those changes that we've seen. I loved the connection to the microwave. It's interesting because I've always connected it to the dishwasher in everybody's home. I feel like generationally, like the ability to do multiple steps in the correct order, like that changed when the majority of homes got dishwashers. And so I loved the pacing when we think about microwaves. So, I mean, there's definitely a shift. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what does that shift look like, and what does that mean now in terms of how people honor death and dying, how people celebrate death and dying, how people practice traditionally. So up here is the last, 40 years? No, actually 50 years, because I still think that 1970 was 30 years ago. My brain won't shift past that, so it's actually 50 years ago. But you can see in terms of faith practice, folks who identify with different religious groups, we see a decline between 1970 and the 2010s. The group that we see that is continuously increasing is the population of no religious affiliation. And so historically, often funerals and death and dying practices were connected for many people to their religious and or their faith practice. And as those demographics change, we see folks' practice change. The new individualization, the new more ecologically friendly. I loved the 53% of funerals not being in at that traditional funeral setting. And so as faith practices change, we begin to see other practices change. As of this year, March of this year, NORC did a survey, and we see that a large percentage, that top left-hand portion, are folks who don't identify with any organized faith practice. We still see a little over half somewhere within the spectrum of Christian practice. This is in the US. But that has changed back from, 7% in 1970 to 20+% now. We also see that how much folks connect with their religion has also changed. Again, this is from this year, March of this year. 29% in March of this year identified while they may have faith practices, in terms of religious practice, they separate those. And so 29% of folks identify as not religious, and only 17% identify as very religious. Moderate and slightly religious, just a little bit over half. One of the questions from this NORC survey that I found really interesting, and there were other aspects of identity that were included. I just chose a couple of the ones that I saw as major. But up here you see that yellow line is religion. And so this was asking folks in terms of their identity, how important is religion to their identity? Not important had the majority of the responses for religion. What I also found really interesting is that while race and occupation are considered essential parts of folks' identities, they're still very important. And gender was the most important, considered the most essential of the four. So looking generationally, this study did have a wide diversity, not only in age of folks who participated, but in regions of the country. And so it's very interesting to see that gender is essential, race and occupation are important, but not necessarily seen by individuals. This is for themselves, how they identify themselves, and that religion is the least or is not important to their identity in the bulk of folks.
Do you guys ever think about dying?
I'm gonna play it again because it went really fast.
Do you guys ever think about dying?
So for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to see the Barbie movie, I strongly encourage you to take some time and watch it. It is very different even than the assumptions or perceptions I had, but one of the biggest shifts that happens is very early in the movie, so I'm not ruining anything if you haven't seen it. It's not a huge spoiler. Is they're in the middle of this dance party, because, you know, Barbie has this dance party every night at Barbie's house, because what else would Barbie do? But in the middle of the dance party, Barbie says, "Do you ever think about dying?" And that is the shift in the movie. That is where everything changes. This idea that we're finite, this idea that we don't actually go on and on and on forever, which prior to Barbie's realization in the middle of this dance party, Barbie world just went on and on forever. Every day was Barbie land, and it was wonderful. And so I really loved the movie. As a social worker, I loved the movie a million times over for 1,000,001 different reasons. But I really loved it as somebody who has been an active part of FCA for the last couple of years, that we are beginning to have conversations about death and dying. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, folks weren't having those conversations. And for that to be the shift of this film is huge. So Pew Research in 2021 asked folks what they believed about what happens after people die. You can see the overwhelming majority of people believe that there's some type of afterlife. The little green, those are the folks who said that they didn't believe that there is any afterlife. But still, overwhelmingly, folks believe that there is something after we die. But what that is, there is a lot of different opinions. The bulk of folks who believe that there's an afterlife do believe that there's a heaven and a hell, which I think most of us go, okay, yeah, I could see most people believe heaven and hell. But interesting, another large group believe that there's only a heaven, or a heaven-like place, however they define that. While not equal to the group who believes in heaven only, it was not quite 10% of those who believe that there's an afterlife. They believe that there is something else, but not heaven and not hell. Interestingly enough, just over 1% believe that there's only hell. I'd like to have coffee with those folks, if I'm being real honest. You know, like, do you ever see those memes that are like, who are the people if you could choose one person to have coffee with? I want to have coffee with those folks, because I think it could be really interesting. The group that I found probably most connected to, Steve and I like to have conversations about religion and faith, and I might have been voluntold that this was my section of the presentation by Steve. But the idea that there is an afterlife that isn't heaven or hell, there is of that almost 10%, there's a group who believe that we go on as energy, as some type of energy. My oldest son is getting his degree in physics. It's not my fault. He got broken somehow. He's going to do theoretical particle physics. I don't know what any of that means. Other than to say, if he had to choose a box up here, the one that says energy would be the one he went for. He'd be like, yep, energy, we turn into energy. And I'd be like, tell me more. And he'd be like, energy, or he'd use words I didn't understand. There is a group of that almost 10% that believe that reincarnation is what afterlife looks like. And to be real honest, I was surprised how small of a percentage of the US population believed that afterlife was reincarnation. I really thought it would be larger. There is a group that believes that whatever comes next is about learning and growth, which are another group of folks that I would be interested to have coffee with. What kind of learning? For what purpose? Does that mean that then you're reincarnated? So is it kind of a both and? There is a group that believes that afterlife is just peaceful. And so maybe for some of you who would check the heaven box, maybe it's the same, or maybe it's different. But for the folks who completed this survey as a sample of the US, they didn't identify peaceful afterlife as heaven. Then the last group, other than the other was everybody else, is the group of folks who believe that not only maybe do we return to being energy, but that we are a part of the universe, and what comes next is our return to the universe. I felt that it was very akin to what Steve spoke about as he wrapped up his conversation, his section on natural burial. That from where we came is where we return. And in reading what folks wrote and identified as the universe, it sounded very similar, that we become back to whatever and wherever we were before we were entities. And so not only are there important conversations to be had about what is it that we want to have happen to our physical being, but conversations are changing about what happens to whatever else makes up who we are. And those conversations are moving away from the church. Those conversations, by and large, are moving away from what has historically been the space and the place to have those conversations. And so one of the things that is important to me and why I've chosen to be a part of this death and dying work is these are important conversations to have with these younger generations about how do we support beliefs that aren't heaven and hell, beliefs that are heaven only or hell only, or you know what, I don't think it's either one of those. And how do we ensure that folks who have different ideas, who don't make up the bulk of this list, or even the folks who are there in the green with no afterlife, how do we ensure that whatever practices they have, whatever things they want done, are honored and available and a part of our everyday conversation? Growing up as someone who is very entrenched in and very connected with Christian faith practice, generationally as well as personally in my family, I see that these conversations not only are happening more, but because of the internet, are easier to have, maybe more comfortable to have. And so how can we use those spaces and those places to allow folks to explore what that really means for them? How can we have conversations about if heaven and hell isn't your answer when asked what happens after you die, then how do we partner that with when you die, what is it that you want to have happen to your physical being? And how do we honor your physical being and whatever you think comes next? Any questions? Done. All right.
Thank you, Amy. I'm just going to add just a little bit because I do think some of it is the cultural landscape as well. And I appreciate the inference to Barbie. I don't know if everybody noticed that Amy has a Barbie shirt on that says, I'm here to thought about dying. But, you know, as many of us, you know, follow the news and celebrities, I just think there's so much going on in the world. But every once in a while we have like a philosopher that comes through culturally. And so for some of us, in the past couple of months, Jimmy Buffett's passing was kind of a wake-up call to many people of my generation and yours. So, you know, part of it speaks a lot to people who may not practice a religion, but he does speak to the spiritual piece of it. And so I'm just going to read that little philosophical saying that he had. I think it was just in his book that he wrote, one of his books. Grief is like a wake behind a boat. It starts out as a huge wave that follows close behind you and is big enough to swamp and drown you if you suddenly stop moving forward. But if you do keep moving forward, the big wave will eventually dissipate. And after a long time, the waters of your life can get calm again. And that is when the memories of those who have left begin to shine as bright and as enduring as the stars above. Jimmy always spoke to the natural order of things and also the fun in life. And so I think I like him as a philosopher. So either way, but I do think as we see other signs in our cultural landscapes that speak to more thoughtful and more purposeful ways of looking at death and it's celebrating. So I appreciate you taking the lead and doing a great job on explaining those, bringing the statistics into it. So I appreciate that.
Any other questions or comments?
From our online chat here. There's a movie currently out called After Death from a scientist and neurologist interviewing people around the world who have died and have been resuscitated. They talk about their experiences.
Interesting. I will definitely have to check that out. I have not seen that. Has anybody in here seen that? No? Well, After Death?
After death.
After Death.
Right.
So now you have two movies on your watch list, Barbie and After Death. Maybe choose different days to watch those. Or the same day. Any other questions?
Going once, going twice.
Awesome. All right, well, I am followed by a couple of gentlemen. Steve, were you going to do their introductions as well? Okay, come on up, Steve. You can introduce our last two speakers.
We have two members of Country Club Christian Church. One's no longer there, but he spent quite a few years there. Dr. George Gordon. He's Emeritus Minister of Counseling and Congregational Care at Country Club Christian Church. He has a bachelor's in mathematics and philosophy, and he has a master's in general pastoral studies, and he has his doctorates in pastoral care and the psychology of religion. During his time at Country Club Christian Church, he conducted 700 plus funerals. He also conducted 26,000 hours of individuals, couples, and family counseling. His hobbies: the Enneagram, teaches the Enneagram, walking on local trails, pickleball, reading about sports and spirituality, and gardening. Dr. George, would you come up?
Now, may I ask, is this the microphone, or is this the microphone?
That's the microphone, the other one advances your slides.
What's that?
The other one advances your slides.
All right. And is there a particular place to press here, or?
The arrow to the right.
Okay, all right, thank you. Well, I appreciate the invitation, and again, I commend Steve for all the contributions that he's made to this organization. And let's see, if I get one of these microphones, can I move? Is on? Okay, thank you. Let's click here. Okay. All right. First, I want to talk about how important it is, the job that you all are doing. Anything related to death and grief is very significant and important. Steve, thank you for the introduction. My primary responsibility at the church was as the pastoral counselor, and Steve gave you the number of hours that I did in individual marriage and family counseling over the years. And you may be aware, but you may not be, how many times people's mental distresses through their lives are very closely and intimately related to their grief experiences. Many grief experiences that have not been attended to properly, and so they have a residue in their lives that they carry with them. And so that keeps the counseling profession in business, is one thing that it does. But it has repercussions for generations. It just doesn't stop with the life of one family. And so anything that can be done to help people experience their grief realistically, but also be supported as they're going through the impact of that is very beneficial, not only to that individual, but the community that is around them and the subsequent generations in their family. So anything that can be done to facilitate a more beautiful experience for those experiencing death, or those who come after them and experience the grief of that loss, is a substantial contribution to the life of the community, the family, and the individual. Well, I believe Joe is going to talk more about grief afterwards. So, yes, I did do 700 funerals plus. From 1988 to 2008, I did a funeral every 10 days. And I'll tell you a little bit about my approach to funerals. I wanted to be helpful to the family in coping or experiencing their grief as a positive process. And so my approach to preparing for the funeral service was I would spend an hour and a half or 2 hours with the family asking them questions. And one of the first questions I would ask is, what words would you use to describe this person? And I would make a collection of those words. And then I would start back with their almost from the time of birth and ask questions through for the next hour and a half plus as their life progressed. And many times people are extremely thankful for the opportunity to go back over the person's life and recall many of the humorous things, the struggles that went on, their idiosyncrasies and so forth, and humorous incidences that whatever they forgot to do at a critical time or whatever. And people will express their appreciation in the months and weeks that follow for having that experience of reviewing the person's life and having the opportunity in the midst of their grief to laugh and chuckle about some of the peculiar things and habits. I'll ask about what were their hobbies and what television shows did they watch and so forth. And I wish I could recall numerous incidents, but I will recall one. Then when I came to the preparation of the funeral service itself and came to the memorial message or memorial reflections, I didn't call it a eulogy, that just seemed too drab. So I would refer to it as memorial reflections. And I think I appreciated it. It was a blessing from the Lord. I began at some point to always give my eulogy a title. And let me back up just a bit. After meeting with the family, then I would ask them to give me the phone numbers of 5 or 6 friends. And I would call those 5 or 6 friends and ask them to talk about the person. And sometimes those were long-distance calls, people they'd gone to high school with or had worked with right out of college. And I would get their perspective. And from all of that material, and they were appreciative of the calls. Many of them would not be able to attend the funeral service, but this was a portion of their grieving to be able to share with me. And I learned a lot about the history of the United States and so forth from talking with people all over and unfolding lives. And so I would come up with a title for my eulogy or my memorial reflections, that I felt captured the life of that person. And so I'm reminded, yes, I've seen Barbie. And my granddaughter's seen it 3 times. So I would recommend it. So, and the title, one particularly I remember, this was for Ken Young. Some of you may have known Ken Young. Ken was on the radio. He was gifted with a radio voice. And he and his wife, Rosemary, were active as their hobby in the Barn Players Theater here in Kansas City. Some of you may know about that group. And the barn was the old Wolf Brothers horse barn out in Johnson County. And the barn was transformed into a theater. It was the original right there just north of Corn Square. It was the original Barn Players Theater. And I would bring dates from Lexington, Missouri up here there was no air conditioning, but they had great lemonade. So Ken and Rosemary were very active there. Rosemary was a woman who got more beautiful as she aged. And their daughters told me that Ken told her she was beautiful every day. And she was. She became more attractive every day. And she had a degenerative disease in the latter 6 to 8 years of her life. But Ken told her she was beautiful every day. And Ken and Rosemary preceded Ken, but the girls were very pleased with his attentiveness to her. Ken, though, enjoyed being a ladies' man. So he moved out to the Forum, and a year after Rosemary's death, Ken had a girlfriend. And he spent time with her and so forth. And she had some medical difficulties, and her family moved her to another facility. And Ken was sorrowful about that. But it wasn't too many months later that Ken had another girlfriend. And eventually Ken's girlfriend was moved up to skilled nursing care. So Ken each evening would go up to skilled nursing care and say goodnight to her. And one evening, Ken leaned over the bed to give her a goodnight kiss, and he could not get back up. So they had to push the buzzer to get the nurses to help Ken up. So I did Ken's funeral when he eventually passed away, and was with a group. And the title of the memorial message was "Forever Young." And so I thank the Lord for the gifts of many of those titles which came as inspirations. Okay. Want to back up a little bit and talk about the greatest generation, because I probably buried 500 of them. The greatest generation, which was my parents' generation, they survived at a critical time in their lives. Some of them were born before World War I. As children, they experienced World War I. As young families, they experienced the Great Depression. Many of them didn't get to experience the opportunities in life that looked like were possibilities for them. They were curtailed. My father didn't get to go to art school. He stayed and helped my grandfather with his dairy for 24 years, which he really didn't enjoy very much. So they experienced the Great Depression and World War II. And the religious experience that followed them in the churches in the 1950s, which were full, but for the most part were very sedate. And they were racially segregated. Our entire health of our nation would probably have been far better off if they had been racially integrated, because we would have had some emotional energy in worship. You'll forgive me. They say the 11 o'clock hour is the most segregated in the time in the nation, and if the black folk will forgive me, it's because the black folk are smart enough not to intentionally commit themselves to an hour of boredom. Okay, so, but I used to be very critical of my parents' generation. You know, there's not much life here in this worship. And then only in recent months, I have realized they didn't want any emotion. They had been through the Depression. They had been through World War II. They had had their full dose of emotion. They were worn out. They wanted peace and quiet. And so, and they did give us, my generation, something that was safe. We grew up in the 1950s, and it was pretty safe. We left after breakfast, came home for lunch, and left after lunch, and showed up for supper when our fathers usually, or our mothers, blew the police whistle or something like that. And my father had a gap in his teeth, and he could whistle. And so we had a great time. But racial segregation should have disappeared right after World War II. It was a shame that it did not. And that's one thing our generation became critical of our parents of. And we had the divide, the generation divide. But our generation as kids grew up in a safe circumstance. Our parents didn't worry about what was going to happen to us down at the end of the block, organizing our own tag football game or baseball game or something like that. So we were very much experienced in learning how to negotiate our own organized activities. We organized them, and we learned how to wrestle and argue and fight and have fun with one another. And we had to organize our ground rules for the softball field, because if you hit it too far up right field, you might break Arlie Shinnyworks' window out. So it was an out if you hit it over Arlie Shinnyworks' driveway. So, and we had to make those kinds of adaptations. And all the older boys had to bat left-handed. You batted with your opposite hand and so forth. But we worked those things out. And part of the problem, and we enjoyed the fellowship of the church, and many of us went to college and joined college fellowships there, and that's where I met my wife. But our kids came along, and it was dangerous. You couldn't let them out of your eyesight with the drug culture and so forth, and the mobility of the society. Child could be gone in five minutes. And so our children were over-supervised and over-organized. They did not have a moment in which there was an adult present organizing their soccer league, their Little League baseball team, their Brownie Scouts, their Cub Scouts, and so forth. And so it's not much of a surprise that they have withdrawn from adult group activities. I mean, my son's married to a Lutheran minister, and they go to church when she's serving at church. But when she's not serving at church, they don't go to church. Other two boys aren't active attenders at church. And so what I think is happening in the church experience is that they do not want to have a church experience that is supervised by somebody else. They want something that's comparable, and let me get to this. Literally, as I said, they didn't learn how to negotiate with one another. And they don't want another series of experiences where someone else externally dominates their social gathering. Okay? As a result of that, there, as has been pointed out, their participation in religious services of the standard type have diminished. They are definitely on the downhill slide. Now, and if you ask many of them their attitude towards religion, they have the phrase spiritual but not religious. And I sometimes have wondered, what does that really mean? Okay. And spiritual but not religious means we don't want to go to church like our parents did. We would like something different. And it's taken us a while to find it. And what, on the corporate side, that's in groups, what have some of them found? Well, if any of you are familiar with the Chicago area and I'm having a senior moment. Bill Hybels started a church in suburban Chicago. What's the name of it? Willow Creek. I've even been there. I interviewed their pastoral staff on sabbatical one time. Bill Hybels was in Arlington Heights, I believe. He was a young teenager. His father may have been a minister, and they were talking about church and so forth. And his friends were saying to Bill, none of us ride around listening to organ music on our radio. And so he began to get the idea, and Bill Hybels himself started the Willow Creek Church. And the Willow Creek Church has no spiritual symbolism except in the bookstore. All right? And the service is essentially what you would have in a rock concert to begin with. And I've been taken to a rock concert by my youngest son, and I was surprised. We didn't sit down the whole time. And you couldn't really hear the artist up there because everybody knew all the songs and waved their hands and so forth. So it was a big celebration. And so now I've gone to some of those churches around here, and that's what it is. The first 30 minutes are just like something you'd encounter out at the Legends or beyond the theater out there. So, but that speaks to them. And then the other portion, they'd have a drama and a teaching. One thing in common, though, is that these big super churches of young people attending are formed by a young person in that community who grew up in it, and they start the church. And that's happened here in Kansas City also. CORE, the Church of the Resurrection, started by Adam Hamilton. One of the elders in Country Club Christian Church was Adam Hamilton's junior high football coach. And so then up north of the river, there's a big vineyard church, 6,000 people. Fred Herron started that. Fred Herron grew up in Parkville. So the churches that are growing in the corporate size are churches that are growing up out of that generation and people in that generation. And so they are there. And usually many times they don't have any relationship to denomination, but the leader is somewhat theologically trained, but he is a part of their generation. Okay. So Lord, let's see where I want to go from here. And they can be very socially conscious in their programs also. And by the way, I'm in a group on every Friday at noon with Fred Herron. So I'll see what else we have here. Okay. Pressed the wrong thing. There we go. All right, there is that group of people. And then there is the individual approach. And this is characterized mostly by individual study. Many times the studies of Eastern practices and thought, philosophical thought, and holistic approaches to spiritual experience like yoga and Tai Chi and so forth. But many times this can be only people who are approaching it on their own. It can be just too heavily cognitive. It's a religion in their head. And what they miss is we people are made of three parts. That's a body, a heart, and a head. And unless we're aware of what's going on in all three parts, it's difficult to have a deeply religious experience, because God made all three of them. And in Protestantism, we have the opinion that many times the body is just a carriage for the heart to get to, for the head to get to church, you know. So, but and so that is one of the limitations. There can be lots of philosophical discussion in the individualistic approach to religion, but many times there's philosophical discussion and study usually keep one out of trouble and off the streets, but they cannot, at times, are not very transformative. Okay, we're on. Here, let me. Okay, there we go. All right, in the individualism, these can form some small groups, and the pastoral function is not performed for these folks by any designated pastor. Any rituals that they have, as has been pointed out, are now not presided over by a pastor, but presided over by trusted friends. You hear of people licensed for a week to perform weddings. Even at memorial experiences, And the memorial experiences may not be in a church. They may be in a gym or a country club or something like that. And the focus is not on having what you would call a worship ritual, but on sharing memories and so forth. And then the actual scattering of the ashes or whatever is done just for the family and private. And so I think it's time for me to turn it over to Joe. So thank you very much. And Joe will Steve will introduce Joe. Thank you.
You want this?
I'm going to stand there.
Okay.
So I don't wander too much. You're up. I'll put that right for you. Say nice things about me now.
Okay. All right, Joe Walker, Minister of Congregational Care, Country Club Christian Church. And in that job, he plans and officiates the funeral services in collaboration with the pastor and the clergy and the music ministry and everybody else. He visits the sick and the dying and their grieving loved ones and provides spiritual and practical support in their time of need. He also presents classes on aging and healthcare and financial issues, advanced planning, death and dying, mourning, grief, and changes in the funeral industry, especially emerging environmentally friendly alternatives. And we benefited from that at the Funeral Consumers Alliance a year or so ago. Joe wrote a story about alkaline hydrolysis. He has a huge background. I was surprised how he's a transitional minister. He served as a transitional minister when you have people get sick and die. Churches also get sick and die. And that requires an awful lot of care and tending and analysis. And Joe served that function for the Westwood Christian Church and Ridgeview Christian Church and
some others.
Presbyterian Church, Kansas City, Kansas, First Presbyterian. Ladies and gentlemen, Joe Walker.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Like I said, I'm going to stand here because my wife says I wander. I want to thank everybody who's gone before. I have enjoyed the presentations. I'm going to check this. Okay, it's already up. That's great. That's perfect. That's where we need to be. When we talked the other day, the presenters all got together online and talked for a minute, and we all had our slides, and somebody said, well, do you have answers to all these? And I said, I absolutely do not. No, I'm going to raise some questions. What we've been talking about today is these changes in the culture and how we approach and how we manage death and dying, funerals. And my lens today is going to be how do we help? How do we support? How do we empower? How do we equip people to function, to plan, to survive the process, if you will, of planning a funeral and caring for someone when they die? I'll say, and you heard a little bit about that from George and certainly from our other presenters from the funeral industry, as the trends are away from the traditional funeral industry, as the trends are away from traditional churches and synagogues and other houses of worship, I'll say with some pride, we fulfill and have fulfilled a function. And it's fine if people want to change how they do this. That's perfectly right and fine, and I recognize that things change in the culture. At the same time, there are some things that we do that now we as a community, as a society, as people who are concerned about these kinds of things, have to think, how are we going to help people fulfill those responsibilities along the way? And that may be with other groups, that may be online situations. There are death doulas now. There are lots of other, obviously hospice has stepped into that gap. I've worked with some hospital social workers and chaplains that have stepped into that gap. But there are gaps, and how do we, if we care about our neighbors and we care about our own families for that matter, how do we look at those gaps and say, how are we going to fill in some of those? And like I say, I don't have all the answers, but I hope we'll raise some good questions, and I'll give you a few examples in the time that we have. And Wiley, I think in specific, you talked about all the online options where you never meet anybody. And I recognize that may be, there's no one size fits all. So that may be great for some people. But gosh, for me, I think there's a lot of richness in being connected with another human in this process. So I would, like I say, just look at these couple of questions here, and I've got a couple more. Like I said, I don't have all the answers. But to begin with, what's the impact of moving from the old 3 days system? Remember, somebody died in 3 days, and that was kind of biblically based, It was also based around some practicalities. The death and dying process was very intense and immediate, and people kind of gathered around each other, family and friends, and there was a lot of intense support, and there frankly was a lot of intense mourning and grieving. That because of cremation, because of geography, because of people's schedules now, that 3 days almost never happens now in my experience. It's almost, now it's a month or it's 6 weeks or whatever. And when I'm meeting with the family, I say, I certainly understand that may be what we have to do, but there is some value to being together in proximity with family and friends in that very intense, immediate time. Sometimes it's not possible, I understand that, and matter of fact, most of the time now, it's not possible, and so that's not what happens, but there is some value to that. I loved the Jimmy Buffett quote earlier, one particular harbor, right? Sheltered from the wind, oh man. So I wrote him a little meditation when he died, so I quoted him. I like that image of the wake. There's an intense wake, there are intense waves right then. And now we know that grief is not a timeline, it's not a straight line, it's not that kind of a process. As a matter of fact, when I'm offering my instructions, and I'll say some more about that in a minute, during a memorial service or funeral, whatever you call it, celebration of life, Thanksgiving for life, I always say, grief is sneaky. Right now, it's really strong and it's really present. And at some point it says, oh, you're good, you're fine. And grief goes down the road and hides behind a bush. And it jumps out at Christmas time or a birthday or an anniversary or you see something that reminds you of the loved one, and it jumps back out and gets you again. So I recognize that there's not a timeline, but it ebbs and flows. But I think we have to address if people are not going to be together in proximity immediately, how do we help our family and our friends, our neighbors, our community, in those intense moments and help them deal with that. The second one is what is the impact on our mourning and grief with the disappearance of the visual of the body, the casket, the urn? I had a service in Fort Scott, Kansas on Monday morning, and the lady was laid out with an open casket. And frankly, it had been a long time since I'd had an open casket, had a casket at all. And I lingered for a minute and just took in again. Obviously, I've seen a lot of folks who have died. I've been with people when they died, and if you've ever been with somebody when they died, that moment is so profound. One moment, the life is there, and the next moment, it's not, and it's profound, and it's palpable. And I had been with this particular person. She'd been sick for several months, laying in a hospital, and I was noticing, even a couple of weeks ago when I saw her, how she was moving toward that stage of not being animated anymore. I should probably say, in my personal experience, my father died when I was 3. My great-grandmother died the next year. My grandfather died actually in the room I was in when I was 7. And so I have just been around death my whole life. So, and I grew up on a farm, so I think I just have a little different experience with death than many people because they haven't been around it quite as much. So I recognize that. That second one, what's the visual? What visual is lacking? Because if there's a certain reality, to use that term, when you see that body, or even when you see a casket, even when you see an urn, it's not as clear, it's not as strong. But this person had life at some point, and now that life energy, that life force, that spirit, howsoever you like to think of it, that's gone. Where it went, Amy, I don't know where it went. People ask me all the time, tell me about heaven. And I said, that's above my pay grade. What do you think? And spin it around. So it's jarring. It's supposed to be. People say, I don't want to look at a dead body. It makes me uncomfortable. Great. It's supposed to make you uncomfortable. It's supposed to make you realize that life is short and precious and fragile, and that your life is precious and short and fragile, and you should honor it and pay attention to it, and not pay attention to it. One of the things that the death of those around us does is it calls us to think about our life and our own mortality. And people don't talk about death and dying and sickness and aging and grief because they don't want to think about their own mortality. And I get that. I'm 67 and stuff doesn't work like it used to. And, that's part of the deal. I spent an hour with a lady, a dear lady, a couple of weeks ago, dear lady, smart lady, smart. And she said, you've got to come over, I'm angry. And I said, what you angry about? And she says, I'm angry about the fact that I'm aging. And I'm going like, oh, it's, kind of part of the deal. So I spent an hour with her, and we talked about that. And she said she's always been very independent, very able, and she's had a whole series in a very short period of time, about a 3-week period, a whole bunch of stuff has happened in her life. And she's not ambulatory, and she's not able, and she's not independent suddenly. And she had never anticipated getting to that stage of her life. I always tell people, you don't have to like it, but it's not a surprise, So we processed that, and we talked about it, and we talked about, things like, Richard Rohr's work and some of the other people who have done good work in terms of aging. We were talking in the vestibule earlier. I was talking to somebody, and I said, my grandmother used to have a kind of a crude saying. My grandmother was pretty straight-spoken. She said, you're here to reproduce, and when nature's done with you, she throws you away. And I said, actually, that, yeah, kind of. I want to say something about the importance of storytelling. One of the things, George mentioned this, and we've mentioned this in other presentations. How do we help? This is one of the things that we do. George talked about. He spent a lot more time with folks than I do. I do the microwave version, but I couldn't spend that kind of time. But how do we help people drill down in those stories? I'm old enough, I buried a lot of, not as many as you, the veterans from World War I, and you buried veterans from the Civil War, right? Doing the math there. I buried some of our heroes from the Second World War, and that was pretty easy to find. The defining moment in their life, or people that survived the Depression. My grandparents survived the Depression, and so I had that familiarity. It is interesting, though, and this was probably 30 years ago. I was helping a family, and the kids never understood their parents. They wouldn't let them put in air conditioning. They wouldn't let them put in a dishwasher. They wouldn't let them put in. I said, well, tell me a little bit about your parents. Well, one of them was born in western Kansas, and one of them was born in western Nebraska at the height of the Dust Bowl. I said, have you never heard of the Depression? And they said, well, what would that have to do with it? So to spend some time drilling down in people's stories and people's family stories is important, and I think if we're not going to be there, okay, but how are we going to help people do that? Because there's a real lesson there. There's a lesson there for the younger generations. How did your grandparents survive a sudden death of one of the spouses, or a divorce, or a crippling injury? How did they survive that? How did they overcome addiction or depression, or how were they resilient? How did they survive? How did they meet challenges? How were they part of the community? There was a lady I'm going to have the honor of officiating her service tomorrow, a quiet hero, a single mom, 3 kids, and all the usual things, loved art and gardening and those kinds of things. But as we drilled down, in her younger years when her girls were little, there used to be a Catholic Charities program here that doesn't exist anymore, but they used to they used to assign, if you would volunteer, you could open your house, if you qualified, you could open your house and you could have an unwed mother come during her pregnancy and through the first part of her birthing process and live with you. This gal hosted 13 girls in that process. That's quiet heroism, and while she was raising her own girls, what an amazing story, and how that plays into what is our role for the common good. So much of George and other people have talked about individualism. What this life is for us, and we're supposed to have a great time with it, but it's also for all the other people. We're all part of a community. We're part of a whole, is what at least I believe. And so I think those kinds of stories are important. We had a gentleman I buried many years ago. The funeral home called me and said, they don't have a minister or whatever. And so I went and met with him. And he'd been in the military, and he'd been an alcoholic, and he'd gotten divorced and wasn't a great father, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, but we'd like for you to say he was a good man. And I said, okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that. Well, in his latter years, he got a small house, he had a nice garden, he gardened, and he gave all of his produce away to his neighbors and the churches and stuff to feed people. Yeah, there you go. He had found a place. See, there's a story there that younger generations need to hear. We had a family, great family, George knows them, great family, and the grandmother had died, and she was old, and the kids, I was talking to the grandkids, and they all said, well, she made great cookies. And I went around the 4 of them, and it was great cookies. I said, okay, no, but we got to do better than that. So I went back around, and there were 3 boys and a girl, and the girl remembered that at the end of the Second World War, grandma had been a teacher. And one day after the Second World War, she went in on a Monday morning to her classroom, and there was a guy sitting at the desk. And she said, what are you doing in my chair? And he says, well, I'm the new teacher here. And she says, oh, no, you're not. And so she went down to the principal's office, she threw a fit, she got her classroom back. But that was a defining moment in that woman's life. And it was a defining moment for her daughter and then her granddaughter. See how those stories are so important. Let's see, one more. Yeah, that's right. I'll just say a couple of words about these last couple of points. A lot of folks have had no church experience, that's very common, or negative church experiences. Many people have never planned a funeral. Most people have never planned a funeral. They have no idea what to do. A lot of people have never been to a funeral. As we have lived longer and as people have stopped going to funerals, et cetera, a lot of younger people don't have any idea what a funeral is about. So when I preside at a service, when I officiate, I always do a preamble. This is what we're doing here, and it's okay to laugh if we tell a funny story. It's okay to cry. It's okay to sit here in stunned silence and say, I don't know what to make of death and life at this point in time. This is a safe space for all of those conversations. I will say, George and other folks have talked about one side of the coin. I'll say, and I found this really interesting, a lot of younger folks will come in and say, what do you normally do? And we get folks who, we call on them, we understand mom's dying or whatever, and they say, bluntly, sometimes they say, we don't want to have anything to do with you. We're not church, or we're mad at your church, or we don't want you to ask for money or whatever, so, we don't want to have anything to do with it. So that's a smaller percentage. But a lot of folks call up and say, mom is dying or has died, and we have no idea what to do. What do you normally do? So I said, well, this is what we normally do, and this is why we normally do it. And many times they'll say, is this what my mom's peers would expect at the service? Uh-huh. Then that's what we want to do, because we want to make my mom's peers happy and comfortable. And I greatly appreciate that. Just what are some roles and responsibilities? It was several years ago, but folks showed up for a funeral and they had gone to a cremation service and, and they didn't do any, they hadn't done a lot of planning with me, and they showed up and they said, where's the guest book? And I said, you didn't buy a guest book. There isn't a guest book because you didn't order one, you didn't buy one. So that was a lesson to me that I always, whatever else we are or not doing in terms of preparation, I give them a checklist. And I would recommend that as you are preparing for your funeral, which I assume everybody here and online is doing, a checklist is really helpful. And there are books and resources, and funeral homes offer them and such. And the other thing I would say is, again, thinking about our neighbors and our responsibility to others, when you're out to dinner or playing cards or going to see Barbie or whatever you're doing, it's a good time to say, hey, I was updating my funeral planning the other day, and people will say, why would you do that? And then you can say, here's why I did that, because I want to take care of my kids. I want my kids and my friends to get the most out of this experience and understand about me and my life. And then I'd say just a word about this. I think everybody is aware of the fact that there's a incredible loneliness and isolation crisis in the country at this point. It's real, it's staggering, it's overwhelming. I think that people are trying to do something about it. I'd certainly recommend David Brooks's new books. How do you know a person? I've ordered it. I haven't got it, but I've got a great interview with him, and I think he's really, and he spoke at our church a couple of years ago. So I think that we need to be aware of the fact that if somebody's grieving and they're grieving alone in isolation, that just makes it all the worse. Again, this should be in my opinion, should be a communal experience. I'll end because I'm almost to time, but I will say this. We've talked kind of shop talk about cremains all day. It's one of the things I think, if you don't take anything else away, one practical thing is to explain to find out and to explain to your family and friends what cremains are, because so many people that are not getting help from a funeral home or their church or whatever, and if somebody with experience end up making mistakes with the cremains that they wish that they had avoided, and it's information that we could say, they don't flutter. If you go out and scatter them someplace, scattering is not the right word because they don't flutter away beautifully in the wind or something. That's only in Hollywood, and that's all CGI. That's not real. They're granular, they fall to the ground. They're white, they fall in the green grass, and everybody goes, oh. So to know what to do with the cremains, whatever you want to do with them, but that's just a really practical thing that people need to know. Well, I've appreciated your time and your attention on this late afternoon. Thank you very much. Anybody else have questions?
I would just like to say I really appreciate the entire day. Yesterday, actually, I went over to a funeral home I was with, she's a friend of mine, and she's almost 90. And she had set up some things, and it was just really nice to kind of go through that process. And everything you guys are saying today is real. And I think encouraging people to understand what they want, I mean, down to the color of the casket, and so she went through everything, and trust me, she's almost 90, she still drives, and she's sharp as a whip. And so I'm sitting there listening, I'm like, I don't want to speak for you, and she was like, so she really spoke up, but it was just really nice to hear in her words what she wanted, down to colors, to programs, and limos, and where, and who, and what. So I just experienced that yesterday, so thank you for your comments today. Any other questions or comments?
Yes, thank you. We talk a lot about changes. Kansas City, Missouri had the first crematory west of Mississippi. I don't know how long ago that was, but that's progress. And I did want to mention that I've had the opportunity to talk to the first black man who was hired in the grocery business here in Kansas City, Missouri, right after World War II. He is still living, way past 90, closer to 100 than 90. But I had to go talk to that man when I found out that he was the first black guy to have a grocery store of his own. He told me that the day he showed up for work at a Safeway store near 12th and Brooklyn, 18 people worked there. They were lined up. He was introduced to them. Only 2, TWO, only 2 would shake his hand. Some put their hand behind their back. And this man was a veteran of World War II. He's not going to be around much more. So if you really want to get a chance to thank him, check with me.
Can I, is this on?
I think she had some.
Is it on now? Okay. Joe was talking about telling stories, and we had a story there. Stories are very important to help with the grief process. Now, if I can share a couple things. And that is, I did the funeral service for Al Horn, Al Horn owned a grocery store that reminded me over east of downtown Kansas City back in the time of the 1968 riots. Al was one of the elders of our church, and I think it may have been a family grocery store that he inherited. In the midst of those riot times, one morning, Joe, this Al Horn, Al opened his store up, and he saw a gang heading towards his store. Now, preceding, Joe was the only grocer who gave credit to black people, okay? And he saw this gang coming to his store, and he thought, oh no, what's going to happen now? When they arrived, they made a circle around his store, and so his store was never damaged in the riots because of the black people who protected his store because of the fact that he had granted them credit. The stories like that. There was another story at a graveside service of a man from Mission Hills, and he and his sister had not become out with one another, but she lived in Independence, he lived in Mission Hills, and they just hadn't ever had a lot of contact with one another. So at the graveside, one of his children came up to me and said, can I give the prayer? Well, I said, sure, if you would like to, that's fine. I don't mind at all. And he said, I want to give it in a language that my father taught me. And I thought, and they thought he created this language. And so the family was there. The man's sister's family was there too. So he gave the prayer in this language that his father supposedly had created and taught him. And lo and behold, the children of the sister responded back in the same language. And you could see the tension melt between the two of them, and the bonds were reestablished. So blessings like that. One other thing I would share is that I felt was meaningful for me to do, and that was the people who are overlooked, who need support, are the morticians and the organist and the soloist. So before every service, after I had a prayer with the family before the funeral started, I would have the mortician and the soloist and the organist, and we'd have a prayer together too. And I now, whenever I'm back in one of the funeral homes, I get a wonderful reception. So. Because every funeral is a trauma not only for the families involved, but when you're around tense people, it's stressful for you also. So, Joe, you want to add some more questions? We have any more questions? All right, well, I want to thank you all. So.
Thank you to all of our presenters today for giving of your time and giving of your knowledge. We really appreciate it. There will be an email coming, so please, again, make sure if you did not register online that you put your email down. We will be sending out the evaluation and the CEUs that follow. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us. Have a great day.